Hi, and welcome back to the HE Enable podcast. This is the show all about sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence, and long-term health conditions in the UK higher education system. I'm Cath, and this week I'm joined by Abhishek, in person, actually, which is great fun. He is a student at Queen Mary University of London, where he is currently studying for an MRes in human rights law. He also received his bachelor's and Master of Laws degrees from Queen Mary. I had the pleasure of meeting Abhishek late last year and spoke alongside him at the Disability History Month event hosted by Dan, a previous guest and friend on the show. If you have ever listened to Dan's episode, you'll know that we were actively advertising it, and Emma, who was also a guest on the show, and Sarah as well, actually. A lot of guests spoke at that event, and where I met a lot of people. It was a good time. And I think you're one of the last speakers I've managed to hunt down, Abhishek. So yeah, I've looked forward to sitting down and talking with you for a long time now. I think it's time we get started. Hello, Abhishek. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to meet you again. And as you referred to the Disability History Month presentation, I will say that I greatly enjoyed your presentation at that event, and I found it extremely illuminating as a disability rights lawyer, as to how these systems work and where and how they go wrong. These things are always interesting insights to have from various perspectives. So thank you for supplying your perspective, and thank you again for having me on the show.
Absolutely my pleasure. And obviously I got to see you speak as well. Thank you for your kind words. Your talk was incredibly, I think I was a little bit in my own head because I was thinking about what I was going to say for my talk. Yeah. But I do remember you speaking, and it was incredibly enlightening, and it was about some of your work, wasn't it?
For it was law. Indeed, yes.
Yeah, and we'll get into that a bit later, I hope, as well. Yes. And what I'll do is that I will link some of the other people from that event and hopefully share some stories, including my own. I'll put in both parts of my story in the description. And I'd really encourage anyone listening to go and check them out. Everyone who spoke at that event was wonderful. So, I've introduced you a bit already, but obviously I know who you are. We've met a few times. Yeah. Please could you introduce yourself to the listeners and share a little bit about your background in higher education?
Yes, of course. So, as Cath mentioned, my name is Abhishek. My full name is Abhishek Dhol. So Dhol is my surname. I was born in New Delhi, which is the capital of India, and that is where I spent the first 4 years of my life. After that, I moved to Bangalore, which is where I completed my schooling, and then came to read law at university in the United Kingdom at Queen Mary, as Cath has mentioned in the introduction. My background in higher education has been studying an undergraduate degree in law and then taking a taught master's, and now a master's by research.
We'll get straight into the bulk of the podcast today, because you are such a deeply interesting person, mate. I've been excited for this. Mm-hmm. If you are comfortable saying, how did or does your disability, I think is going to be the most relevant one here, impact your experience of higher education?
I should first start by saying that it impacts my experience of higher education quite significantly and on a daily basis. But we first need to establish what my disability is for the purposes of your listeners. So I'm totally blind with a condition called retinopathy of prematurity, ROP. That was essentially the result of issues with my eyes caused as a result of me being born several weeks before I should have been. So in terms of how this impacts my experience of higher education, I would say it impacts it from the perspective of accessibility, as in what materials are accessible to me and what materials aren't accessible to me, whether people are mindful of what my accessibility needs are and that they have to be taken into account when coming up with materials for my modules or for whatever. That is perhaps the most significant way in which it impacts my disability, impacts my experience of higher education. I suppose it also impacts my experience of higher education in a social sense, as in one has to have social interactions with other people in higher education settings, networking, informal socializing, getting to know people is a part of being at university and taking a degree, regardless of what you want to do with that degree as a career path. And so the experience, on the one hand, sometimes being isolated and perhaps a little on the sidelines of some of those kinds of situations, networking kind of situations, and yet on the other, sometimes being supported uniquely in a way that makes me feel seen, welcomed, and included as a blind person, being supported in a way that takes into account the specific difficulties I face. I think that that is as much an experience of higher education unique to me as anything related to accessibility, because feeling that being included is a sort of bonus or something really good to have is not a feeling that people who don't have some sort of a protected characteristic would normally experience. For them, being included as part of the conversation, as part of everything that is going on, is the default setting, and there would be questions asked if somebody was not feeling that way. Whereas for me, it still often feels like a bonus. So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but those are some of my experiences of higher education as a disabled person.
Yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense. I think one thing that I'm thinking of in your case as well is this is just what I'm thinking. The inclusion is so much more important, not just because it should be happening anyway,
Yeah.
but also because the amount of forethought and effort that needs to go into planning that, like, it's hard to be spontaneous.
Yeah.
Because, for example, we met you at your accommodation, we walked over together.
Yes.
And we had a nice chat, but I know that the building we're in right now is unfamiliar for you.
Yes.
And it's something that, just because it's a complicated campus,
Yes.
it's hard to navigate here when you're independently when you're unfamiliar with it.
Yeah.
And there's that extra element of planning as well, where even if you live on a campus,
Yes.
that inclusion's so important because it's going to be something that the events of the inclusion is something you have to plan for and foresee and anticipate, even getting a guide, for example.
Yeah, and getting a guide is just one facet of it. I mean, even if it is in a general area that I know, or in a building, maybe even if I haven't been to that specific building, that building is in an area I know, I have to plan so many things. I mean, where I come from in India, for example, the way doors work is not always the same as how they work here. As in, I haven't come across things like card access controlled doors or doors which are controlled by buttons in my home country, whereas those are features here. And so getting used to that itself was a significant change. And so as to not cause embarrassment for myself or for other people when going into venues, even into venues near to ones where I know, I tend to have conversations around how do doors work? Are they sliding / automatic? Do they require card access control? If so, where is the card access control? So lots of questions and lots of unique advanced preparation, emotional quasi-intellectual labor that has to be done, which is not an experience that I think many sighted / non-disabled people would have. So yes, that was a very good prompt from your side. That is another unique experience of higher education for me.
Yeah, thank you. I guess the only equivalent I could think of with my sighted friends is Oscar was on the show a while ago. So Oscar's the chair of the Disabled Students Society at Manchester Metropolitan University.
Right.
And he raised some very interesting points around how even if people can see where their key cards need to go on a key card access door,
Yes.
their chair will get in the way of them being able to reach, or it's not the right height. And then they struggle to both tap their card and make the door, or the card reader's out of reach, especially if you're not an ambulant wheelchair user.
Yes.
And I think in a way it's still not the same, because I feel like you could at least see the key card thing and be like, that's not accessible for me. But it's one of those things that you've pointed out that you don't really, I feel, think about until you need it.
Yeah.
Where, I wouldn't be asking these questions about doors. I'd be like, that's annoying. This looks like this is card fobbed. But you wouldn't be able to tell whether a door is locked or not, or whether by what medium it's locked, or whether you're allowed in. And that will become a whole battle, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose to respond to both of your points, I suppose it's variations of the same thing for people with different disabilities. As in, a sighted wheelchair user would have the question about heights of keycard readers, like you mentioned, or even if they had muscle-related difficulties with their arms pushing open a door or something like that. So it is variations of one problem, which I identify as, the environment not being universally designed or universally accessible properly. That might sound very simplistic, but it is at the end of the day a problem which manifests itself in different ways for different people.
Tell you what, it's a really good example of equity and having an actual equitable society. And it's one of those examples which, like, it does only benefit in our context disabled groups and that protected characteristic. But I'm sure if we brought in people from other marginalised groups as well, they could probably be like, oh my goodness, yeah, this is a problem too. And it's starting with those little things and building up. But I'm going to steer this conversation a little bit. One thing you spoke about was your experience of doors in your home country versus in the UK, so coming from India to here.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you about that more broadly. Sure. So obviously you came to the UK for university. You'd not been to school. I think you said you'd been to visit here before.
I had, yes.
And I was wondering what your experience was like accessing higher education from a disability standpoint when you moved over to the UK. What was that like for you?
It was a transformative experience, I would say. And overall, when one says transformative, one tends to mean in a good way. And yes, that is how I mean it as well. There were good parts and parts which could have been better. But yes, I mean, when I say transformative, I mean it in the sense of there were things that are just easier for me to have access to here in terms of getting adjustments of various kinds, be it orientation support to get used to the campus or books in accessible formats, that would still be very, very difficult for me to get in my home country. People always talk about things changing. The sort of pet slogan phrase about this topic in India and in other developing countries tends to be that things are changing for the better now. And while that may be true, the experience of disabled students that I'm seeing there is still largely people having to run from pillar to post to get things which I can take for granted here. That is definitely something I feel hugely privileged for. So yes, that is excellent. I think it's transformative also in the sense that it required a change in my psyche, because in societies or in setups where one has to either run from pillar to post to get the necessaries to help one succeed on an equal playing field to the non-disabled, one tends to not place too much faith in the system and rely on oneself as much as possible. So transitioning from that into a system which works on the basis that there are competent professionals in the form of the disability services staff at the various universities whose job is to help students get what they need to succeed, and who have made a special study of how to do that for students with different kinds of disabilities, changing from, oh, I have to rely on myself, to I can get help. In fact, I should get help to make the most of this experience, is very much like an ocean crossing phenomenon, mentally, of course.
Because you were saying to me, I think last time we spoke, was that on paper, the disability characteristic protections they have in India are similar to the UK on paper.
Yes.
But the way that they're actually enacted is very different.
Very different indeed. One could do some 4 or 5 podcasts on that. But yes, that is very, very much the case. I mean, if I were to give just one small example, things like a PDF converter software that most of the universities, Queen Mary among them, have in the UK, which is called Census Access, that converts inaccessible image-based PDFs into typed text that is screen reader accessible for a blind person. That is not available at the overwhelming majority of Indian universities. And for somebody who is studying a reading heavy subject like law, you can imagine how difficult that would make it for somebody studying in those systems. So that is a concrete example, in my view, of the differences and how they manifest themselves.
Yeah, and because I remember having that conversation with you.
Yes.
About just like how the disability laws were meant to be very similar, cross-culturally.
Yeah.
And I was very surprised because obviously you will have technology that you use here, I'm guessing, as part of disabled students allowance.
I don't get access to DSA being an international student.
Is it a lot of free and open source software then? I know, so one thing that you guys won't be able to see as listeners is that Abhishek is wearing Meta Ray-Bans, which are actually used as assistive tech, because you use them as a reader, essentially, don't you, for labels in shops and to hear your messages?
Yes, I use the Meta Ray-Bans for personal purposes. Yes, that is true. But yeah, I mean, for my tech, for higher education purposes, yes, it is largely, you're right, free and open source software that I use. So the screen reader I use is called NVDA, non-visual desktop access, and that has been something that I've used both in India and in the UK. So transitioning to the UK higher education system in that way wasn't difficult for me. But when I talk about that transformative experience, I mean it in the sense of just understanding how different things were for me versus for people in the UK system who have been in it for longer than I have, especially who have been in it from their school days. You mentioned the DSA, for example, which is only accessible to those with settled status / indefinite leave to remain, or who are British citizens. That entire system gives you access to a piece of assistive tech called JAWS, or Job Access with Speech, which is another screen reader like NVDA, in some ways better, in some ways not. It's just that my understanding is that blind, visually impaired students in the UK are brought up with JAWS from cradle to grave, essentially, because the government helps to pay for your access to it. My understanding of these things is perhaps not as high as it should be, but that is essentially how I believe that works. And coming from a system where essentially the government is too overwhelmed with a very high population of people to deal with to care about whether an individual blind person learns software or not, to a system where the government pays for your software access while you're at university or through access to work when you're in employment is almost like changing planets, at least in my mind.
I mean, in that regard, we were speaking a lot about kind of that. I mean, potentially that's an obstacle. You said the technology is better in some ways and in other ways it isn't. I think you should have a chat with my partner after this because he is a big advocate for free and open source software. And I'm sure you guys will have a lot to talk about. We've kind of spoken about that aspect of access. Yeah. But I was wondering more generally in terms of the obstacles that you faced in your higher education journey. Have you encountered any obstacles during your experience of higher education? Did you manage to navigate them, and if so, how?
I'm going to give my first answer to your question is going to be a slightly lawyerly one. Having studied law, that I have a bad habit of giving that kind of an answer, which is that it really depends on what you define as an obstacle. So if you're talking about obstacles from a purely academic perspective, I would say that the system has worked well enough for me that I've had few to no obstacles, or the ones that I have had have been pretty trivial to navigate. Things like having a publisher once giving me a PDF of a book, the PDF they supplied me being corrupted, and then having to sort of entirely re-download and reinstall the PDF software I use. If you count that as a sort of obstacle, then yes, that is an obstacle of facing a situation where I had to use an online proctoring exam software, which was being used by my cited counterparts as well, in which they were allowed to use the spell check feature, but where the spell check feature of the software was not accessible for me, and therefore I had to advocate for myself to use Word and paste my answers into that software. Navigating those kinds of things, I suppose you could call them obstacles, but what I would call an obstacle, or what I really felt to be an obstacle, was actually more on a non-academic side, because I think that the non-academic elements of the higher education experience are as important as the academic elements. When I say non-academic or quasi-academic, I mean things like living in halls or other experiences you have, extracurricular kinds of experiences. And so on the non-academic side, I think the universities have some improvement to do. Queen Mary has improved significantly since when I joined, and it is working every day, I think, to improve even more. But yes, I think in getting the help that I needed in certain non-academic aspects, for example, this may seem like a prosaic example, but learning how to use a laundry system in halls that was not designed with blind people in mind, or getting the specialist training I needed to be able to navigate the campus on my own. Those things took longer to fix than my academic adjustments did. And the only way to navigate that, I found, was perseverance and just chasing it up as often as I could.
You made a good point by starting with the legal definition. I think this might be a flaw in how I ask my questions.
I should interpose to say I didn't really mean it as a legal definition. Yeah. I just meant it when I said I will give you a lawyerly answer. The phrase "it depends" is a phrase that lawyers love to use. That's why I said it depends on what you call an obstacle.
This is true. I have lawyers in my family, and I am guilty. Maybe that's a lawyery term as well, of doing it depends as well. Oh, what's the context here? But no, I think you've raised a very valid point, is that in the way that you divided up your definitions of obstacles in that sentence with academic versus non-academic, but it's bits that you can't access that being a member of the university, university sports teams or societies or the campus. Yeah. It's easy to forget that university is such an integrated experience.
Yes.
That is all still the responsibility of the same institution, just different bits of it.
Yes.
And I think that it's very easy for people to forget that university isn't just academics if you're, say, looking at an outcomes-based approach, where a lot of it's going to be based on grades and then maybe student experience comes second. I mean, I'm not sure if you're aware of it. There was a report that was put out in February where disabled students, I think it was OFS, can't remember, their grades were increasing, but the actual student experience was decreasing. And it's a matter of how we're going to marry these two parts, essentially, to reduce obstacles in both.
Yeah, I think the only part of that which I'll push back on, and I'll elaborate on this pushback when we come to the specifics around my experience as an international disabled student, is you mentioned that there seems to be a lack of clarity around different parts of the university having responsibilities for different things. I would say that the situation seems to be a little more murkier than that, as in, for reasons I will elaborate on when we talk about that specific international experience. There are situations in which the universities, the way their hierarchies and their responsibility structures are designed, don't seem to know exactly who should handle a specific thing in relation to an international disabled student. And even if they have an idea of who should, how that handling, if I may put it that way, should be tailored to the experience of an international disabled student as opposed to a UK student where the processes might be different, is often something that still tends to leave a lot of university administrations and individual administrators a little bit stumped from time to time. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, if you want, we can just flip the questions. I can ask you about this right now. So you've obviously alluded to what I'm going to ask, and I'm absolutely okay with that. You have come to Queen Mary and in turn arrived in the country as an international disabled student.
Yes.
And that was obviously, as you've said, transformative experience for you. And I was wondering if there's anything you'd wish you'd known about university as an international disabled student before you started and came here.
If there is one specific thing that I would say I wish I had known, it is general tip or a general conceptual point I will make is that knowing that there are processes or ways to adjust certain processes compared to how they work for UK disabled students so that they work for international disabled students as well in non-academic areas. And that if you don't know how these processes are supposed to work for you as an international disabled student, if you don't have that knowledge, that reading, that priming in advance from whether that be a university website or from your networks, then you could have a far more difficult time than if you knew how to handle those processes and advocate for yourself by hitting the exact right advocacy benchmarks which you need to hit. So yeah, essentially what I'm saying is that if you are an international disabled student, you often need to be your own lawyer or your own advocate. Perhaps your own lawyer is a bit too scary a term, but your own advocate in ways that UK disabled students don't necessarily need to do.
Yeah, or if not, it's in a different context as well.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, my personal experience is you heard from my speech, I had some support plans go missing. Yes. I'm not a lawyer, but I was raised by one.
Yes.
And it comes down to the same principles. I know when you say be your own lawyer, it can be intimidating, but whenever I'm giving advice to disabled students, even if they're home students, I'm always like, okay, here's how we're going to make a paper trail. Here's how we're going to get ABC, just in case these things go wrong, because sometimes it necessitates that. I'm
not disputing that at all. All I'm saying is that things that you might assume are places where things won't go wrong and shouldn't go wrong, especially like what I mentioned, laundry or getting campus orientation and mobility. Those may not seem very high stakes when you're just thinking about academic outcomes or whatever, but those might require as much advocacy sometimes, if not in the beginning, at least more for an international disabled student than it might for a UK disabled student.
Yeah, especially because you have to adapt to possibly a new social system as well.
Not just because of that, but because there are systems of social care that are available to UK disabled students to help them manage personal care matters, which are not available to international disabled students. You need to find a way of getting support for those if you need, or to adjust inaccessible things to allow you to be independent.
Yeah. I mean, I'm so happy I've got you on the show for multiple reasons. But one of them is like, this is a perspective I will never have. And I'm really glad that I've been able to get you on as someone who can speak to this, because I can't, right? I'm going to ask the next question, just building on the back of that, and then we'll go back to our regular order. But if you have anything else to add, how do you think we can improve the experience of higher education for international disabled students? Is there anything on top of what you said, or anything like a new point entirely? What do you think?
I think based on other international disabled students I have advised, I would say having someone who can advise you as to how the system works, someone who can advise you from a student perspective that this is what you may need to do in certain scenarios, is one of the best things a university could do.
And so it's mainly just that peer support as well.
I think peer support is definitely a very key aspect of it. And I'm not trying to blow my trumpet here, but processes and systems that international disabled students I have advised have been able to navigate more easily than I was able to navigate it, because they had certain information that I was able to give them.
And that's how it should work in a way. And not in the sense that we remove the onus of responsibility from the institutions, but I think that if you're thinking about, I don't know, like some kind of utopia ideal, right, you'll have your institutions working, you'll have your students' unions working, and then you'll have that thriving community on top of it.
Yes.
And it's, in a way, kind of mastering that multifaceted approach that you're going to get the richest experience from.
Yes.
Actually, that transitions us very well back to our questions. So I was wondering whether, speaking of peers and friends and support, whether there were any clubs, societies or initiatives that have made a significant positive difference to your time at uni.
Yes, I would say there are. I think in terms of societies, I was on the leadership committee of a society in my second year, which was called the Queen Mary Commercial Awareness Society, which helps students gain various kinds of experiences for careers in city law firms, investment banks, etc. Not the typical kind of experience you would get, I suppose, if one were aiming to become an academic right from the undergrad days, but still a useful experience because it helped me gain confidence. I think people have identified in the context of various protected characteristics, whether it be women, disabled people, whatever, that people from these minoritized backgrounds tend to be less confident in these spaces that have excluded them for so long. So being able to do something which helps you stand on your own 2 feet, hold your head up high, metaphorically put your shoulders back and say, this is where I belong, and I am not going to apologize for saying that I belong here because I do, is a very good thing. And so that society leadership experience helped me in that way. The second of 3 initiatives I can think of was the law clinic that my university's law school has. Like most law schools in the UK, my university has essentially a department within its law school which arranges for students to gain practical work experience under the supervision of practicing solicitors, barristers, etc., on advising clients in real life cases. And so I was actually sent on a sort of sabbatical from my university's law clinic to a collaboration law clinic between the law clinics at Queen Mary UCL and the other London institutions, and two corporate law firms. And this clinic helps asylum seekers with their humanitarian protection and refugee status claims to the Home Office. So I think this also helped me in developing my advocacy skills, as well as and I know we'll come to this when talking about my career in academia, as well as actually helping me decide that I didn't really want to be a practicing lawyer long term and wanted to go into the academy instead.
I am very excited to ask you about your career in academia, actually. I didn't know about the law clinics. Was that a lot of travel around London then? Or?
A lot of it can be done online, but I did have to travel for certain training workshops to the offices of the corporate law firms that the clinic collaborates with.
Ooh, that must have been in the city then. That must be very fancy.
Canary Wharf area, yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know Canary Wharf area.
Yeah, you know the type of places, large buildings with multiple towers, revolving doors, security at the entrance, lifts that can only be accessed with key cards, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think regardless of whether you're cited or not, I don't think the vibe changes.
Yeah.
Cool. We've only got a couple questions left. Sure. Before I ask you about the academy, I want to ask you a question I ask all of my guests.
Yeah.
No is a valid answer, though you've already outlined some of your perceived strengths.
Yes.
Have you experienced any instances of your disability proving helpful in a higher education setting?
The answer I would give is that I don't think a disability is unhelpful. I wouldn't say it's helpful. It can be distinctly annoying. There are inconveniences and things you experience that other people don't, and all that sort of thing. But I don't know about helpful, but I think at least for me, I wouldn't say that it's been helpful, but nor would I say that it has been unhelpful.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair.
Sorry, I know that's sitting on the fence, but...
No, I mean, I think that it's healthy to have that response sometimes as well. I think I've had guests come on the show before. It was like, I wouldn't take away my experiences, but I'll take away, my health sucks. I'll take that away right now. And I've had others that are like, wow, I couldn't have done my thesis without being able to hyperfocus or having that strength. But sometimes there is a strength in having that balance as well. And I don't think it's just from the perspective that people know where their limits are, because it's not that, but it's just knowing, I guess it's a realist approach. Would you say that's fair?
I suppose a realist approach would bring in aspects of being very pragmatic, because there are elements of things like the research that I'm doing. I do think that I bring a perspective to it that other people wouldn't bring. But at the end of the day, research requires originality, whether you're disabled or not. So this is just the way for me to do this perspective to the extent that I have a unique perspective because I'm disabled, if at all, is just my way of satisfying that originality requirement.
Yeah, and I think that you have a lot of intersections to speak to as well as an international student, as a disabled student.
Yes.
And being able to marry that as well, which is probably, I can take a guess and say that's an underrepresented group in UK policy making and in the UK Academy.
Very underrepresented,
yeah. But that is what you're trying to do. So please, tell me why you are choosing to pursue a career in academia. I've been waiting for this question.
Right. I think when we were discussing it, you had asked me if this was a slightly broad question. And it might seem strange to people from some other fields that this question is being asked at all. But it is being asked, and I feel it's an important question because academia is not necessarily the most obvious choice for somebody who reads law at university, especially at one of the perhaps more well-known London universities, because the Magic Circle, the American law firms, they tend to present more obvious career options to most people. I chose to pursue a career in academia for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I just enjoy writing, reading, and thinking very carefully about complex texts, complex concepts, and ideas. I mean, there are various ways you can do that outside of working in higher education, but higher education is definitely one of the very good places to be able to do something like that. I also mentioned previously that I didn't enjoy as much as I thought I would the idea of being a practicing lawyer when once I came into contact with the gritty reality of what that was like in a lot of scenarios. I mean, it's a lot, at least from what I experienced. Even in the highest courts of the land, it can often be more about arguing about facts and how the law applies in a certain case. I abstract ideas, arguments as to why is the law as it is? Could it be another way? If it could, should it be in another way? And how do other disciplines impact law? So that sort of thing, the gaps between what practice asks and what academia asks, I felt were better satisfied for me in the academy. And if there is a disability answer to it at all, as in you may wonder if at all disability plays a role in the calculus, and it does, at least for me it did. And that is that the only other career in the law I would have considered was being a barrister. I just feel that because of structural accessibility concerns in terms of how much traveling has to be done and things like that, which would make it harder for me to be a barrister than to do something else. And yet, being a barrister requires many of the skills of being an academic as well, like a very high level of academic inquiry into the law and things like that. So I just felt that considering some of those structural obstacles as well, academia would be a place where I could more effectively make use of the talents which I specifically have as compared to other areas. It may, of course, be very different for somebody else in a very similar position to me, but this is just the way I felt for myself. I just feel that you're allowed to think about the law in certain ways in academia that you wouldn't practice either as a solicitor or as a barrister, just wouldn't have time for.
I'm going to have to curtail this conversation here, mate, because we are nearly at time. But before we close, I have one more question. Maybe in a sentence or two, if you can.
Yeah.
If we consider everything we discussed today, what is one key takeaway that you would like listeners to remember from your story?
Determination and resilience is and will continue to be one of the biggest factors that can lead to a disabled person succeeding in whatever career ambition they have in mind.
Yeah. It can be an acquired skill, but it's definitely a necessary one.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect note to end on, so we'll leave it there. I'm just going to close this up and then I'll hit the stop record button on this fancy microphone we're using. But HE Enabled is the show all about sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence, and long-term health conditions in UK higher education. If you are listening to this before the 10th of May, congratulations, you're listening on Patreon. That means you're a patron. Thank you so much for supporting the show. If you want to join, it's like £1 a month. It would be great to have you there. I post some nature photography and I also post early episodes as and when they are available. If you want to support the show financially but can't dedicate monthly for whatever reason, that's fine. You can buy me a coffee as well. The link to the Patreon and the Ko-Fi are linked in the episode description. But other than that, I think we're done. Abhishek, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, no, absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.